Alright, friends and neighbors, welcome back to this voice over IP journey. This is going to be part 2, and in a way we're sort of closing out part 1, which was traditional telecom, but today we're going to talk about organizations and a really big event. So first up is the ITU-T, the International Telecommunications Union Telecom Sector. So the ITU has been around for a long time, and the related group is the Telecommunications Standards Bureau. Now, the ITU-T doesn't actually come out with what we would call standards. It actually comes out with things that we call recommendations, but they're really the same sort of thing. Now, the ITU-T has actually been around a long time. The graphic on the right here is this really lovely depiction of that original agreement. And here's a little blurb from the ITU-T history. From its inception in 1865, the ITU-T has driven a contribution-led, consensus-based approach to standards development. So what that means is that everybody gets together and they come up with something that they think is a good idea, and then we bat it back and forth. And that's true of most of our standards organizations, whether we're talking about the IETF or the IEEE or the ITU-T. So somebody comes up with an idea, a group of people write it up, and then it gets out for public comment. And the idea behind the ITU-T is that no matter what group you were part of, no matter how large or how small, you had equal access and equal input to the formation of that standard or recommendation. All right, so that's kind of the idea. Now, the telecom sector, part of it, is clearly about telecom standards. So previously we talked about the PSTN being actually a global thing, and so this is really the related idea in which we're defining the standards and recommendations and the ideas associated with that sort of global network. Now, along with all of this, so we've been talking about traditional telephony and telephony in general. We're going to move into VoIP, and those are all sort of wired technologies, or at least in our brains that's what actually happens. But a big part of both the ITU-T and we'll see here the FCC in the United States is the regulation of RF, or radio frequency spectrum. One of the other goals of the ITU-T sort of is that we want everybody on a level playing field. So they spend a lot of time talking about development of standards and telecom infrastructure in the third world, whatever that means to you. Now, in the United States, and really in most countries, there is another regulatory body for that particular country. So in the United States we have the FCC. But there's this exchange of ideas and exchange of standards for use in every country. And so we still see ITU-T recommendations used here in the United States all the time because our PSTN connects to the global network too. Now, the Federal Communications Commission. This is a US-based agency. Previously in the United States, when you think about communication historically, right, we have Alexander Graham Bell and we have the Bell system, but before that there were things like RF communication, Marconi, Tesla, and of course telegraph. Well, in the United States, those kinds of communications have been largely regulated since 1912 with something called the Radio Act. The whole point of the Radio Act was to try to avoid interference between all of the folks that were using radio communications. Now, the really important issue there was police band and fire, rescue, those kinds of things. Even back then, we wanted to prevent interference between those frequencies, and we didn't want folks using it when emergency services were trying to get transmissions out. Okay, so the FCC replaced the Federal Radio Commission, and this was all formalized in the Communications Act of 1934. And here's a quote from the FCC site. The FCC regulates interstate and international communications by radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable in all 50 states, D.C., the District of Columbia, and all U.S. territories. It's an independent U.S. government agency overseen by Congress. So that's an important distinction. It is a government agency, and so there is some level of oversight there. And so the FCC is responsible for enforcing communications law and regulations. Now, it's funny that there's this list, right? Radio, television, wire, satellite. If somebody thinks about another way to communicate, the FCC will begin to regulate that. Now, another important aspect of the FCC is that it sets prices for phone, data, and video, and then decides what, who can sell what. So TA 1960 or 1996, that's a reference to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And of course, we've got all of the standards. Now, standards, as you may recall, are not just about how to packetize something or how to get two systems to communicate. Really, it's about a universal way of doing something. And so whether you're looking at a physical connector, the shape, size, number of pins, the electrical side of it, the voltages, and then the signaling, what a binary 1 means, what a binary 0 looks like, all of those things are part of the standard. And then, of course, all of the fields and subfields associated with a particular protocol. We're used to looking at packets on this channel, but we have to remember that long before there were IP packets, there were still packets of data, fields of data that were organized into messages that were sent across the PSTN. Now here is our big event. So capitalism. Whatever you think about capitalism, we certainly have good examples and bad examples of companies that engage in capitalistic tactics. Now, AT&T is probably one of those companies that had a lot of good ideas and a lot of desire to reach customers and everything else. But historically, they've also been flagged for a number of, well, I'll say aggressive capitalistic tendencies or tactics. So here's the statistics, right? AT&T's local telephone monopolies accounted for 80 to 85% of all access lines in 1982. So what that means, if you picked up your phone, there was an 80% chance that AT&T was providing the service. And around here, we call that a monopoly. And monopolies are generally bad. So in 1982, 1983, 1984, the U.S. Department of Justice had a case against AT&T. And what they decided to do was they were going to take this massive company that was AT&T. By the way, the name AT&T comes from American Telephone and Telegraph. So AT&T has been around for more than a century. And so they had a very early start on this. So what the Department of Justice said was that, look, you are too big, and so we're going to break you up, and we're going to decide what each component part is allowed to do. So there were 7 regional Bell operating companies that were created. So we split this off. So now think AT&T, and then there's this sort of 7 sections that are broken off. And AT&T itself is not allowed to provide local exchange service. And the regional Bell operating companies are allowed to, but they're not allowed to do long distance. Now here's where AT&T shows their genius. Right? They say, all right, so we can't provide local exchange service, but we're going to keep our research and design arm, right? That's okay. Are we allowed to do computers? Is that okay? Yes. So this whole trust busting, this whole event was also called a modified financial judgment, and it resulted in the destruction of AT&T. Okay. As also, sort of fallout from this, AT&T becomes Southwest Bell, or Southwest Bell comes from AT&T. So there's this creation of this new company. Where we are at the end of, sort of 1984 is we've got AT&T and Southwest Bell, and then we've got these regional Bell operating companies, and they're about the same size, and those are our local exchange carriers. Now, in 1996, along comes the Telecom Act of 1996, and the stated goal was to promote competition and reduce regulation in order to secure lower prices and higher quality service for American telecom customers and encourage rapid deployment of new technologies. Okay, sounds like a really good idea. I like low prices. Everybody likes low prices. Usually competition is the thing that does that. But there were some keywords and tricky phrases. So the R-Box, which previously had been limited to local service only, couldn't get into long distance, it was suddenly determined that they were allowed to as long as they satisfied conditions for competition in their area. Now, whatever that means. Oh, sure, we've satisfied your conditions, and now we're going to get into a new area, which we previously were not allowed to do. AT&T was also changing at the time. So here's a really interesting quote right from the AT&T website. 12 years later, so this is post 1982, 1983, 1984, 12 years later, the Telecom Act of 1996 drove major changes into the competitive landscape of the telecom industry. So SBC, which we now know comes from AT&T, expanded its U.S. presence through a series of acquisitions, including those companies listed below. In 2005, AT&T was acquired by SBC, creating the new AT&T, a leader in global communications for business. So what we see is almost a return to the pre-1982 condition. The big elephant in the room at the time was computer-based communications and what we now know is as the Internet. Now, another fun thing in all of this was that previously, if you wanted to change your phone number or you moved and you wanted to take your phone number with you, you couldn't do it. In fact, even cell phone companies wouldn't let you do that. So in 1998, they said, listen, this is ridiculous. We're talking about movement of a couple of wires here or an administrative change to a config file. So it wasn't actually a big deal, but they used to charge you for it or they said it just couldn't be done. All right, so we've been throwing around a couple of terms here, so let's put a little bit more finer point on that. So in the previous talks, I had this graphic up on the upper right here, and that is the local exchange, the internet exchange, and then the local exchange carrier. And that's kind of, it's a 10,000 foot view, but a local exchange carrier was somebody that offered local service. So think LATA and area code. So those kinds of things go along with a local exchange carrier. It was a very geographically oriented sort of look. Now, a local exchange carrier might have service in several LATAs, but what you weren't allowed to do is provide connections between LATAs or area codes with your own service. You had to contract that out to an inter-exchange carrier, which is why it used to be on my phone bill, I would have two sets of charges. I would have my local exchange service and my long distance service. Now, post-modified financial judgment, we had the RBOX. And the RBOX were the incumbents. Those were the regional bell operating companies that came from AT&T. So they're the ILECs. The competitive local exchange carriers, those appeared when competition was sort of a requirement, right? So that was the Telecom Act of 1996. So we have two groups of local exchange carriers now. We have this group that sort of came from AT&T and the group that didn't. Now the inter-exchange carrier is a separate entity, right? A separate company, not a local exchange carrier that allowed connections between the local exchange, and that was our long distance service. And this, of course, harkens back to the day of, buying a long distance charge card or toll charges, things of that sort. And all of this stuff, the crazy bill between local exchange carriers and long distance service, the charges for individual circuits for your local loop or your tip and ring, or even if it was digital, the toll charges associated with calling long distance or overseas, all of these fed into the success of voice over IP. In fact, one of the number one reasons for the success of voice over IP is the cost associated with telecom fees, charges, and lines. All right, so that was sort of closing up our talk about traditional telephony, but also an introduction into some of the organizations associated with telecom standards. Now, these organizations, just because they came from a traditional world, doesn't mean they're not part of our world today. They certainly are. So and we'll see that later when we look at some of our packet captures, you'll see the standards identified in those captures. And we also talked about a really, really big event, and that was the 1982 modified financial judgment against AT&T, and of course the Telecom Act of 1996. Now today, things are a lot more confusing and a lot more complex than what we've gone over today, but this sort of gives us our basis. Voice over IP really was what we call a disruptive technology. It really sort of threw everything up in the air. Today, more and more services are offered over IP networks than maybe over traditional telecom circuits. So this is really, really key. All right, we'll close up right there. Keep watching to continue your voice over IP journey. Like and subscribe if I helped, and hey, may those packets and phone calls always reach their destinations, even if they're going over AT&T networks.